Christmas is a time where we often reflect on the birth stories of Jesus Christ. And we do so in such a way that what we're trying to do is listen to God coming into the world, to be dwelling among us in flesh, to reflect on that, and to pay attention how He is coming into our lives now. Now, we've been, instead of focusing on the birth narratives of Jesus, we're focusing on John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. And what we've been doing is using this text to reflect upon, to meditate on the incarnation, and to pay attention, to wait and to watch, to see how Jesus is coming into our life today. As we continue in this text today, what I want to do is I want to look at the verses 14 and 16 in particular. If you have your Bible with you, I encourage you to keep it open. I'm going to be focusing on and reflecting upon this text. Verses 14 and 16 talk about grace. And I want to ask, if life was not hard in any way, if life for you had all the things that you needed, but not just you, if life for all of us had everything we needed with no suffering and no pain, if life was not hard in any way, would we still need grace? C.S. Lewis asked the question in his book Out of the Silent Planet, when one of the characters that Ransom meets on a different planet than ours talks about, could we know love if there was no danger, if there was no hardship? Would we know love in its fullness? And I appreciate when I think about the love that my wife has for me, that she chooses me out of all the other options that are available to her. Yeah, that was not a joke. That was meant to be sweet and tender. And we choose to love one another in spite of the dangers, of the hardships that come through a marriage, through trying to live together, through trying to work out the problems of life together. Love chooses, even in the midst of danger and other options. As we reflect on grace today, we're going to pay attention to that. God's love at work, even in the midst of dangers and hardships. Asking the question, how do we prepare room for Him in this season and from this text? So we'll be asking the question, what is grace? Well, is grace solving everything for us? Is grace something that comes in and makes all of our problems disappear? Or is it feeling good? Is it a good, pleasant feeling, and then you know you have grace? Is grace a place where there is no shadows? In order to talk about something like grace, we have to use metaphors. Metaphors help us to understand, help us to think about something and the way it means, the way it interacts with us. So I'm going to use a few metaphors today, and I encourage you, if you're able, keep count of them. Whoever gets the closest count of metaphors at the end gets extra points. John chapter 1, verse 14. John tells us that Jesus comes full of grace and truth. And then verse 16, from His fullness, out of His fullness, we have received grace upon grace. We have received out of His fullness grace upon grace, and Jesus comes full of grace and truth. Jesus does not come full of grace, period. Jesus comes full of grace and truth. Do you want to know the truth? Do you think you can handle it if it exposes you, if it shows you? As Christians, we tend to want to hear John say, Jesus comes to us full of grace. And we cheer and we celebrate. Yes, says John, and truth. And a little bit of piece of us goes, shoot. Just kind of hoping it was just the grace. Because truth exposes us, doesn't it? It can expose our friends, and we don't want to feel vulnerable. We don't want to feel exposed. We don't want to feel the pit opening up at our feet. But there is no grace without truth, I think. Jesus brings grace and truth. This is His fullness. Truth without grace, I think we can all imagine. Truth without grace, strict, serious, demanding. Perhaps you've been in a space where you feel very clearly that you are in the right, More than likely, when we're in the right, we tend to feel like we're going to lean a little more on the side of truth than on the side of grace. I think we can all imagine truth without grace. Yet Jesus comes full of grace and truth. Without grace, truth instead becomes something not of God. It gets twisted. It's no longer His fullness revealed to us. Similarly, grace without truth. Sounds okay. Shouldn't that be just fine? Isn't grace always good? Why didn't God just bring grace? Nothing but grace. Because grace without truth simply does not set us free. God's grace comes in a variety of ways. We can talk about the graces He gives us of good sleep or the provision that He gives for our family. But in this text in particular, and the text throughout John that he's trying to explain to us, when he's talking about grace here, he's not just talking about good gifts God gives us, he's talking about the grace of God for sinners. In the 4 verses prior to verse 14 here, John says that Jesus was in the world came into being through Him, and yet the world did not know Him. Jesus came to what was His own, and they didn't accept Him. They rejected Him. It's in that context that we hear John tell us Jesus is full of grace and truth. John is linking grace and truth because if we just receive the grace without the truth, we don't get to experience the freedom from sin that God is bringing to us. John develops that further. In chapter 3, Nicodemus, a Pharisee, comes and meets Jesus in the middle of the night. And Nicodemus, he's trying to come to Jesus where he doesn't get exposed to anyone else that he's actually coming to Jesus. That's why he comes in the middle of the night. And he's trying to understand Jesus, and Jesus tries to explain it to him. And I think what Jesus is doing here is explaining grace and truth and how they are together. For God so loved the world, says Jesus, that He gave His only begotten Son, so that whoever believes in Him would not perish, but have eternal life. God did not send His Son into the world to condemn it. No, but in order that through Him the world might be saved. Those who believe in Him are not condemned, but those who are not already condemned, because those who do not believe are already condemned, because they do not believe in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light, and do not come into the light, so their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that by their deeds they have been done in the light. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. When Jesus tries to explain the good news of the God's only begotten Son coming to earth to redeem sinners, He speaks of it in such a way that you have to see the light, you have to pay attention to the light, you have to step into the light, you have to experience that truth. Otherwise, you can't experience the grace. It simply isn't there for you. Just as there is no grace without truth, there is no truth that can be present without grace unless it's not of God. So truth and grace of God needs to have both grace and truth at all times. God's grace is a light that comes into the world and exposes people by its truth and by its goodness. And God's grace that exposes by its goodness and by its truth lets people in to look upon the one who is gracious and loving and truthful. And then the grace is given by believing in Him that we might become children of God. Jesus reveals God's glory in this way, the fullness of grace and truth married together, as the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Having reflected on verse 14, taking the weight of that, feeling grace and truth together, let's now listen to verse 16, where it says, "From His fullness we have received grace upon grace." Grace, and then a word, and then grace. What word is there? In the translation that was read in the Bible, the NRSV translation, it's the word upon. But perhaps you have a different translation in front of you. If you have the NIV, you'll notice that it says grace in place of grace. Or perhaps you have another version of the Bible where it says grace for grace. The Greek word there is anti, A-N-T-I. A word that has, or a preposition that has come into the English language. We hear it in words like anticlimactic, antimatter, antidote, antibody. It means against or in place of. So from his fullness, we have received grace, anti-grace. So often this text, when we hear John tell us of Jesus bringing grace upon grace, we think of the mashed potatoes that you get at Thanksgiving or Christmas. And if you're Karis Coolsmith, my daughter, it's grace upon grace upon grace. A little more grace, please. Pile it up, please. Like, just give me the mountain of it. But the word here from John is anti, grace in place of, or even against grace. It's a grace that replaces the previous grace. And I want to ask each one of us, and myself included, do we have the courage to face that? To hear God giving us grace, replacing the grace we already have. God draws us in. When he first met you, when you first heard him calling to you, he'd probably been calling for a little while, but you finally heard it, and you came to him, and it's a wonderful meeting. But now it's been a few years. Are you willing to let go of your early grace so that you can receive grace in place of grace? Or are we holding our early graces so tightly in the fist? John shows us what he means by grace in place of grace. So he says that in verse 16. In verse 17, he gives us an example. The law was given through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. Grace, anti-grace. Grace in place of grace. Again, I'm going to use C.S. Lewis because he's just that good. C.S. Lewis in the book of Narnia, in the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, at the end of the book, the kids come to the professors. They've been to Narnia, they've explored it, they've experienced who Aslan is, and they are talking with the professor. And the professor tells them, you won't be able to go in that way again. You were able to get in that way, to experience the grace of God with you, but you're not going to get to go in the same way again. And I very much feel that God does this with us. He doesn't let us return and use the same means of grace or the way of grace again and again and again, because he doesn't want us to turn him into simply a slot machine for us, where we keep pulling the lever until finally all the coins come rushing out. God does not want us to interact with him as if he was a slot machine. God uses imperfect means to call us to him. He works through them to bring us to himself. And then as we grow up and mature with him, we can actually look back and see, the way that I came to God, it's a little imperfect. I'm going to set it aside. I'm going to look for new graces to come to me. Or perhaps later in life, you've experienced the ways and means of which God has given you grace. He has taught you something, and you've learned it, and it's been fruitful and borne fruit in your life. But you've now been holding it so tightly, and you can't let go. And God is just beside you saying, I've got something else I'd love to teach you. I've got a new grace for you, but it needs to replace the grace you are holding so tightly. This is a picture done by Julia Tabernero, one of our resident artist lovers of Christ. And this picture, I think, she shared it with me after I shared what I was speaking on today. This captures for me the idea of a grace that has to replace an existing grace. The shell for the bird is a grace. It gives protection, a chance for the bird to grow, to get ready to come out. But the shell has to break, of course, for the bird to actually come out. The bird needs a new grace to replace the existing one. I've had the pleasure, the privilege of experiencing this where someone in the Christian faith realizes that they're holding on so tightly to something that they believe is a grace from God that they are stopping new grace from coming in. I watched a man stand up in a room that was full of hundreds of people. We were in the middle of a debate. And there were two mics, and you would stride up to one of the mics, and you would explain your position on the debate, on what we were deciding. This was the Christian Missionary Alliance. This was the annual General Assembly, and we were deciding whether or not women should be ordained. It had taken quite a few years to get to this point. This man strode to the mic, and everybody saw him get in line. He's extremely well known. Everybody in the Alliance knows his name. He has gravitas. He has white hair. He has influence. He carries weight. The Hebrew word kavod. He has it. It came to his turn at the mic, and he spoke on the issue that we were debating. And he comes to the mic, and everybody knows where he stands on this. And yet he says, I speak for the motion. This motion is not what I would craft, and the conviction I hold is not in alignment. However, this should pass for the glory of the kingdom, so that more might see and know the kingdom of God. Grace he had received. He thought he understood, yet he found himself in a place where he had to set aside the grace that he had received so that new grace could be known through the people of God. So often our understanding of God becomes labels. So often our understanding of God becomes a box that we put him in. I've got it figured out. I know how this works. And then it starts to feel like an incantation. If you kind of just do it the way that I'm proposing that you do it, it should work. Oh, it didn't quite work for you? Let's just pull the lever again. Let's make it happen again until it works. One of the ways, now I'm going to give an example of one of the ways that I think we have a grace in the Christian faith tradition that actually needs to be let go of. I'm giving this as an example, and you may disagree with me, and that's totally fine. We can chat about it later, or you can just hold your disagreement in silence. That's also fine. I'd love to talk if you're open to it. I'm going to give this example, and you might disagree with it. But don't hear that as gospel truth. The gospel truth is grace in place of grace. And in your own life and in your own heart, you may disagree with me where that lies, but hear that text, even if you disagree with my example. My example is this. We coach each other and our children to pray the prayer. We try to get our children to pray the prayer at a young age, where we hope that they will then commit to Jesus in a way, shape, and form that will extend through their entire life. We're trying to get them in the door. And I think that praying the prayer is a form of a grace that needs to be replaced. What we've done is we've taken something that we know works and we've made it more into an incantation. As long as you say the right words, you're in the door, you've crossed the line. But what we're realizing now that we didn't know maybe 50 years ago or so is around the ways that psychology and sociology work, and that a conversion doesn't take a simple moment, but a conversion actually happens over a period of time. And so often when we end up trying to get children, young children, to pray the prayer at 5 years old or 6 years old, they're praying the prayer because mom and dad are smiling. Even if they're not in the room, the child knows, mom and dad will be so pleased with me. And what they're doing is they're participating in the communal faith, and that is to be cherished. But it's not a conversion for them, because at that moment, they're really experiencing and participating in the communal faith, which is very good. But as they grow up, as they move through high school, as they come close to university, they're going to be asking their own questions. And the hope for all of us is that they would develop into authentic faith that comes in their older teenage years, when they start to say, you know what, this is my faith, not just the faith of my parents, not just the faith of the men and the women that I respect and admire, but I believe this, and I'm willing to die for it, and I'm willing to live for it. This is what I feel when I think of a grace in place of grace. We take something that we know works, but what happens is we no longer seem to let the Spirit move in new ways, for a new time and a new space, new people, new context, new ways of being. We think, well, it worked before, let's do it again. We're trying to make it into a recipe, if you know what I mean. If we are willing to open our hands with the graces that God has given us, what's it going to feel like? It's going to feel pretty vulnerable, isn't it? It's going to feel like letting go. Micah, are you saying that there's nothing I should really hold on to? Not at all, because there are core elements to the Christian faith that are not at all up for grabs, and you can see these in the creeds. You can see these in the core things that the church has believed in all times and in all places. But again, in chapter 3 of John, remember that Jesus says that the wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from and where it goes. So it is, Jesus says, with everyone who is born of the Spirit. We can be so quick to say we've got God figured out and we know how it works, that we're not letting the Spirit blow and move in the new ways that the Spirit would like to. What God is inviting us into in this idea of grace in place of grace is a ways and means for us to let go so that we can actually stand stronger. Letting go feels like, well, I was just wall climbing yesterday in a way that I haven't wall climbed in about a year. And so, having not wall climbed for that long, I'm on the wall and it feels incredibly shaky. I'm reaching up for the next handhold and it feels like I'm not sure. I'm probably going to fall and it's going to hurt. And for my reflection upon the church is we often feel this way. We want to hold so tightly to what we know because if we let go of that, we feel like we're going to fall. But what God reveals in this text and throughout the whole Gospel of John is that if we're willing to receive His grace in place of the grace He's given us, that our letting go, our weakness, and our vulnerability allows us to receive immortality. Nothing short of it. Letting go of the grace that we have received allows us to participate in the new life of the Spirit. We get to experience and participate in immortality. Grace that is piled up, grace upon grace upon grace, it becomes idolatry. And we're not truly free. We are, in fact, slaves to that mode of grace. It leaves no room for the Spirit to do a good work. But grace in place of grace, if we're willing to let it go, we enter into that posture of humility that God gets to blow where He chooses. For unto us a child is born. The egg has been broken. The government shall be on His shoulders, and His name shall be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Whatever you're feeling and experiencing this Christmas, in the ways and means that we are having to meet with our families and meet with our church family, the way the restrictions have imposed upon our life, God is not finished with you yet. He has more grace. We don't have all things sorted out, and so I encourage you to, as we prepare for Christmas Eve, make room in your heart. Is there a space and a place where perhaps you're gripping so tightly to a grace or a gift that God has given you? And He might be asking you, Micah, could you hold that a little bit more loosely? His grace might be just beside you, but you can't see it. When you play hockey, you always have to keep your head up on the ice. If you just keep looking down at the puck, you're not going to see where to pass it to. And I think God is asking us, keep your head up, you guys. Look what's coming next. Don't hold so tightly to the grace that I've given you. The incarnation is coming, and we are watching and waiting, looking forward to Jesus to come. Let us do so with open hands to receive the grace that He gives us, preparing Him room in our hearts, our minds, and our souls, so that we would always be ready to receive the grace that He is giving us. In His name, amen.